Once upon a time, a long time ago, all the people of the world spoke the same language. Can you imagine? And they got together and they said, let's build a tower. Let's build a tower that's so high that we could touch God. And they made bricks. And they collected the mud to make the bricks. And they built that tower. And they built it and they built it and they built it. And God looked down on them from up above and said, this cannot happen. And the story says, God destroyed that tower and knocked that tower to the ground and scattered the people all around the world and made them speak languages, different languages, so they couldn't understand each other. That tower is called the Tower of? You've heard the story before. Comes from the Torah. And the rabbis of the Midrash said that it wasn't bad that they built the tower, but what was bad was that as they were building the tower, it happened when you're in a construction site, sometimes people fell off and hurt themselves, but no one stopped building. No one stopped to take care of the people who were hurt. No one stopped to worry about the people who couldn't complete the tower, couldn't work on the tower, because they'd hurt themselves while building it. And they said that was the sin of the Tower of Babel. So Rabbi Josh and I, we thought to ourselves as we read that story together, if we were going to write that story today, how would we tell that story? And what would be the lessons that we would tell for our own generation? So what is it we came up with, Rabbi Josh?
Well, once upon a time that hasn't happened yet, many years from now, our overlords at Google came up with a new phone. I saw some of you guys sporting it tonight. You couldn't put it away. And the key to this new phone is that all you had to do was think something, and it would automatically generate a text message for you. You didn't have to talk. You didn't have to type, no thumbs, no keys, no voice. It just automatically generated a text message and sent it to the desired party. And better yet, there was a universal translator built in so that no matter who you were talking to, they would get the message in the right language. Hebrew to English, Russian to French, Russian to Swahili. It didn't matter. All you had to do was think, and the text got sent. Now, for those of us with big thumbs, this was a godsend. And after a while, people started to realize just how much work talking and writing is. When you write, you got to sit down and put pen to paper, or you have to swipe your thumb, or if you got to type, but thinking, it just happens. And talking is work too. I've got to use my voice. I have to stop chewing long enough to say something. And in fact, when I try and talk, very often somebody else tries to interrupt me. But when I think, I can complete that entire thought and put it in text form. And so very soon, people stopped talking and writing entirely. They would just think, and the text would send. Thank you. Restaurants were quiet. Homes were quiet. People just didn't talk. They forgot how, because all they had to do was think, and the text message would send.
Generations passed, many generations, and people actually forgot how to talk. Can you imagine that? And phones now were built without speakers, without microphones, because people could communicate by thinking, and the text would appear on someone's phone. You could just think an order for food, and the order would be texted to a restaurant, and it would appear at your front door. And you could even thank the delivery man or girl by thinking and texting him. Even husbands and wives stopped talking to each other and just texted. And they stopped worrying about the person receiving the text after a while, and texting became meaner and meaner and meaner, and people started thinking and texting things like, you're stupid, or you're a liar, or you're ugly. And people would copy each other's texts, and they would send them to each other. Can you imagine that? Who would do that? They couldn't stop. They had to text. After all, it was the only way to communicate. But the texting just got meaner and meaner, things I can't even say here in this sacred space. And people stopped texting things like, I love you. And they started texting things like, I want, and I need, and give me, and get me. And at some point, and then no one remembers exactly when this happened, but at some point, a red button appeared on every single phone. And on that red button, it was written, emergency disconnect. Now, no one knew what that was for. They didn't know what it meant. So no one dared touch it.
Now, if any of us had taken the time to look up from our phones to see the faces of the people we were communicating with, we would notice that every message we sent would elicit some sort of reaction. If I happened to send something nice, it usually aroused a smile, maybe even a glow in someone's face. But if I said something mean, or if I said something impolitely, it usually caused somebody sadness, or pain, or grief, or anger. But since all I had to do was think and text, there really was no need for me to look at anybody's face. And so those texts started to cause more and more pain, and more grief, and more misunderstanding. In fact, a lot of people started to hate their phones. But what could they do? No one knew how to talk, and no one knew how to write. Everybody was chained to the phone, whether it was a good message or a bad one.
So one day, one person couldn't take it anymore. He got tired of being hurt and insulted and bossed around and treated like a robot. And he looked at that red button on his phone, that red button that said emergency disconnect, and he said, I wonder what this does. And when that last mean text came through, that last word of abuse from some person who couldn't imagine the look on his face when he received it, when he got that last message, he took his thumb and he hit the emergency disconnect, and quick as a flash, his phone turned into a Samsung 7. Gone. Well, no sooner had he pushed that button when it seemed like an epidemic had crossed throughout the world and people were pushing emergency disconnect buttons and the phones were just flaming out right in their hands. And when those phones stopped working, all of a sudden people realized they had a problem. No one could communicate. All of a sudden, the world went silent.
And people woke up in their rooms, and they had to figure out what it meant to interact with other people.
Sorry.
Slowly but surely, the bravest person went to the door and opened it, and they found their family members, and they started making hand gestures and signals until they could begin to communicate with one another. And eventually, they started matching sounds to these signals. I'm not sure what the language they created looked or sounded exactly like, but I'm pretty sure it's a little different than English, which is very difficult. But the funny thing was, as they communicated, whether it was hand gestures or with words, they were always looking at one another to see what the response would be. And so when they talked to each other, they found that they really liked it when they saw someone else smile back. And they found if they were nice, if they were giving respect, the other person would smile. And so they started being more polite, more respectful, more loving with all of their communications. And they also discovered that when they said something mean, or if they didn't take the time to recognize the importance of somebody else in their communications, if all they were saying was, I want, or I need, or give to me, they noticed that that smile didn't come. And sometimes they caused angry faces, and sometimes even tears. And so people stopped doing these things as much. They spent far more of their time trying to elicit a smile than a frown. They became considerate, sensitive, polite even.
So the folks at Jugal, of course, Jugal, realized that the world still needed phones, because after all, you had to communicate across distance. So they designed new phones. Now you could still think and the words would appear on your text, but here's the catch. When the person on the other end read the text you sent them, the phone would snap a picture of their face. And it would send that picture right back to you. And as soon as those words were read by the person that you were sending your message to, you'd see what those words caused them to look like. You'd see how their emotions responded to the words on your text. And in fact, that was the only way you could read the text. You had to have your face in front of the phone, and the person sending it had to see your face.
And so slowly but surely, the world started texting again. They dipped their foot gently in the pool. But they did so a little more politely and a little more considerately. And they concentrated on using loving words instead of unkind words. They asked how people were doing. They used their please and their thank yous. And they never stopped talking to each other with their voices or their hand gestures. And the world was indeed a better and kinder place. Unfortunately, Jugal hasn't quite invented that phone yet. We're still stuck with these models. And though we can't always see it, there's a face on the end of every message we send, whether we're texting or posting or emailing or tweeting. And we should remember that indeed there is that face, and that face responds to our words, because our words matter. Whether they're on a phone or on a computer, our words build a bridge between us, a bridge that determines the type of relationship we'll have and whether or not someone feels rejected or someone feels loved and appreciated.
So the lesson from our modern cell tower of Babel is that whenever you send a message, you need to imagine the face that's receiving that message, whether it's an email or a text or a post on Facebook. And if you can imagine the face and how the face might respond, then you'll understand the greatest lesson of all that comes to us from deep in the Jewish tradition of the future. Words matter. Words matter.